1850 tribes of Oregon, or Western Oregon at least. Quite a few, as you probably know or suspect. Western Oregon had a little more diversity of tribal peoples because there's a lot more stuff going on. There's a lot more rainfall, a little better environments for growing things, for developing food sources, a lot better soils, things like that. So we have probably a good 60 some tribes in Western Oregon all alone. These are the ones I sort of pulled out. This is pretty much all of them. And we'll talk about mainly a narrow subset of these people, mainly these people in the center here from the Willamette Valley, the Tualatin, Yamhill, and those folks in this area right here. So, because if I wanted to teach about all these other things right today, it would take me a couple more hours of time. I don't think we have that time. So this is basically the area. This can area in the middle is what we're going to talk about mainly today. All right, let's move on. So first off, just mentioned treaties. So there were a number of treaties that were unratified that sort of set the stage for later ratification of treaties. 19 unratified treaties in Western Oregon, and because of this, tribes were removed. The last sort of unratified treaty was the Coast Treaty of 1855. Tribes were actually moved onto reservations, even though the treaty was never ratified, and they had to wait some 17 years to hear that. So that's something. And then we had one of the treaties, the Tualatin Treaty, was also not ratified. So that's a short introduction to unratified treaties. We're not going to talk about those much, but I always like to note we had a good number of treaties in this area that were unratified. And then the ratified treaties, which are the ones the tribes really depend on today. We have all of these sort of Cow Creek, Rogue River, Umpqua, Kalapuya treaties, Shasta Coastal Treaty, and the Kalapuyans, etc. treaty. The Cow Creek Treaty with the Umpqua was actually the first treaty ratified on the West Coast, and then the Southern Molalla Treaty is the last one. So there were two individuals involved in treaty making and management of tribes, George Gibbs and John Flett. Those of you that know the records there at Fort Steilacoom, the history, know these two individuals. They were both part of the community there for a good number of years, and had their own sort of like histories up there, somewhat different from Oregon history. But in Oregon, both these individuals were part of Oregon Indian Administration, the superintendency. They served as sub-Indian agents at times and treaty negotiators. Gibbs himself became a pretty prominent figure because he knew how to speak Chinook, and so he worked both in California and Oregon, helping to negotiate treaties with the tribes because of his speaking ability. He was also a surveyor by training. His first job was a military surveyor on the West Coast out of Astoria, and so then he basically knew a lot about the tribes. And then he became kind of at first an amateur, then more professional researcher on tribal languages, and he was one of the few individuals we have on the West Coast that were part of the initial startup of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. So pretty influential individual. I have a lot of respect for him and the things he did. And then John Flett was kind of a helper of Joel Palmer, who was the Indian superintendent, and Flett for a number of years helped administer the village at the Tualatin tribes at Wapato Lake, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But Flett, we have a lot of records of him. I've gotten records from archives up in Washington about him, and I really would be interested in more help finding more information about him and Gibbs because I am constantly researching these individuals and their contributions to tribes in the area. So let's move on. As part of the treaty making and then subsequent removal, in the midst of all this period, there were a number of wars happening. The Rogue River Indian War, the Yakima War, those kind of wars were happening. And because of that, that stuff happening in exactly the same time period as tribes are being planned to be removed, Joel Palmer decided to remove tribes to temporary villages all throughout Western Oregon to sort of protect them from basically the ultimate issue, which would be extermination of the tribes, which was actually being proposed in Oregon at the time. And so we see in 1855 all of these temporary reservations developed. There's one on the Columbia at Swissler's property. There's one called at St. Helens. There was one at Oregon City. Palmer had one on his property himself, and then one at Yamhill, and one outside of Lake Labiche called Kalapuya Temporary Reserve. And then further south, we have these Lucky Mute on the top. We have the Chief Joe Band Santiam Reservation. We have the Lewis Band Santiam Reservation. We have Takelma, and we had the Chimafo. And then even further south, we had the big Umpqua Reservation on the coast. We have the Coos Bay Reservation at Empire. We have the Umpqua Valley Reservation, and we have Cow Creek and Table Rock. And so these are all set up to as temporary holding areas until the tribes can move to permanent reservations later. And so the removals began happening in 1856. Palmer was propelled to remove the tribes because of all the threats of genocide by essentially white settlers in the area, and so they all began in around January, February 1856. Some 4,000 people were moved to what became the Grand Ronde and Siletz or Coast reservations. Other tribes were moved on to sort of Warm Springs at the same year, but those were not part of Western Oregon necessarily. The first was the Umpqua people and the Lucky Mute Kalapuyans had moved to Grand Ronde by February 1856. And then Grand Ronde itself was supposed to be a temporary reservation, sometimes called the Yamhill River Reservation too, but that was actually made permanent in 1857. So the Coast Reservation was also made permanent in 1855, but the problem with the Coast Reservation, it was kind of this untractable wilderness, so it took several years for people to be able to actually live there. So they had to spend time to develop areas for administration of tribes. And we're talking about at least 2,500 people were moved on to Coast Reservation at one point by 1957. So I'm not going to talk about these other ones down below. I mean, they're all were just these various removals in preparation for sort of giving all of the rest of the land to white settlers. So the Grand Ronde Reservation comes into being again in 56 as a temporary place, then later becomes a permanent reservation. This map by Hazen, who was a lieutenant out of Fort Vancouver, made a plan for where the Rogue Rivers, the Umpquas, the Kalapuyas, the Klamaths, the Molallas, and Twelves are all going to be living. The Kalapuyans pretty much got the Central Valley, which is the best part of the valley where there's actually farming area. And then the south of this river right here were basically the Rogue Rivers and Umpquas. And many of the Rogue River people moved over to the Siletz agency on the Coast Reservation about a year later. So, but we had at the last sort of like the earliest number, some 1,200 people living at Grand Ronde and a little over 2,000 people living at Siletz by 1857. Here's the numbers at Grand Ronde initially. This number drops within a year to around 1,200 people. I believe because a number of people died. There was a lot of like disease in the camps, mainly because you put all these people from different areas of Oregon into one area, along with their sort of white administrators, and then that's a perfect sort of formula for having new diseases crop up in the people, and then a lot of death. And so we see some 500 to 600 people die in that first year because of this. And then this is some of the details about the Coast Reservation over time. Initially established with many people from the coast. All these people listed on the far left side, from the Umpqua River down to the Winchuck River, were all moved to the Coast Reservation. The reservation in this center gray slide is about 100 miles on the coast, and then it became this area which kind of followed a straight line between the Umpqua and to the Tillamook area. And Grand Ronde was added on sort of an afterthought as a temporary reservation, but it became permanent later on the right side. Over time, various parts of the Coast Reservation were taken away. 1865, the two sections of the reservation were actually one section of the reservation was terminated, and then in 1875, two sections were terminated, and it was reduced down to only the section at what's now called Lincoln City, the sort of center section, which became known thereafter as the Siletz Reservation. So in the camps, these were kind of set up as camps. They had some money coming in from treaties. People were really kind of set upon to sort of survive. Many people were living in poverty with really no housing given to them. They didn't know how to plant crops, or were not given the tools to plant crops, you know, the right type of plows and such and seed. So they were not able to create food. Plus the soils at Grand Ronde were very poor. So there was no opportunity to really grow enough food for the people. They were not given allotments of land till like the 1870s. They had to build their own roads and develop a fishery near Salmon River to survive. They began the sort of reservation economy had many crafts, but people began working in the summertime, going off the reservation and working in the valley as summer, in essentially the same as indigenous farm labor, the sort of migrant farm labor we hear about today. Many men began going into the timber industry for to make money, because timber industry would take anybody, and actually they saw Native people as sort of natural foresters, so they began to accept them in greater numbers, and so people realized they can get a fair wage if they will join the timber industry. And tribes didn't have rights as citizens until 1924, so all of this happened with them not being truly represented under the law, and basically depended on federal agents to minister to them, which was not always the case, not always fair or in their interest. And they had their own Indian legislature on the reservation with their own laws at Grand Ronde, which we have copies of. So they did some development, some positive things. They did find ways to survive with the little land they were given into the 20th century. So the policy of the Indian Agency nationally was really for assimilation. And we see that in the way that the native children were treated. They were taken into boarding schools and day schools on reservation and off reservation, and forced to sort of adapt to an American culture. They, missionaries were forced among them, were actually assigned to the reservations. So I call it the three sort of legs of assimilation. First, people were given missionaries, then later they were given schooling by missionaries, and then they were forced also to become farmers, and something they'd never done before, because farming was not a thing in the Northwest until that was forced upon them. So this were some of the more successful policies that actually were successful in our area, and I suspect in many areas, assimilating families into the sort of American lifestyle, American culture, quite successfly. You know, I set this whole thing up as kind of a survey, a very short survey of the tribes. This is what we call colonization, the moving tribes off their land, giving land to settlers, and then changing their culture, colonizing them to become essentially white people, so that in the future they would no longer be able to claim native rights, native sovereignty, or be tribes at all. But, as I do my research, as you may have suspected, by reading my book or not yet, there's a lot more to that story, a lot of more intricacy to the story of your removal and assimilation. And I'm now at a point where I'm looking for additional research data, information to fill in the story. And so one area I'm going to is environmental studies. And so this is the biggest area of my presentation. I call Reconstructing Traditional Indigenous Environments in the Willamette Valley. The valley was a pretty significant place. It attracted many colonizers here, settlers here, because of the amazing potential for agriculture, which has now been realized in the 20th and now 21st century. So I'll show you how we got to this point. You know, we're doing a lot of work in the valley here among tribes and tribal peoples, scholars, figuring out sort of things like restoration projects. How do we restore our environment? So here's just a brief overview of some of the restoration work we're doing. We've done some testing of how the white oaks in our valley, react to fire and smoke. Perhaps they create more acorns. They're a little more healthier in that environment. So we're doing that on a regular basis in various areas of the valley. I've gone back into other records to figure out what the valley was like before, because we really don't have really great descriptions of what the valleys were like before everything essentially was colonized and changed here. So back to 1841, we have records from George Emmons and James Dana, parts of the Wilkes expedition that came through and were surveying areas and taking information about the area. And they noticed that the whole prairie in August of 41 was burnt. And that contrasted largely with the green patches of woods, narrow belts bordering the streams. So they're showing basically the difference between a moist area and a dry area. And so they're showing the behavior of the fire during the time when tribes are actually setting fire before they're being interrupted by settlers, when they're actually continuing to practice their culture. In September 1841, same thing, as they walk down through the valley. So we do have other accounts of fire setting from Jesse Applegate. His memories from 1844 suggest that the tribes were setting fire to the prairies to sort of collect what they call the wild wheat, which would be roasted in the pods, and they would collect the seeds and then turn that into some sort of a flatbread, a powder for like a flour. And women were actually the ones that were doing this activity. They were the ones that were controlling of it and setting the fires and using their basket and bats to gather the grain. Kalapuyans in the valley pretty much used juncus as their main basketry material. And here we see an example of one of those juncus baskets, a very soft-sided basket that from the area. So this is just more evidence about our burning. Oak savannas are pretty important to the area. We still have a few that are remaining. We're trying to preserve those and study those as best we can so we can do more to bring back additional oak savannas and maintain them in our area. These are areas near Basket Slough outside of Rickrell, so very picturesque landscape. Perhaps one of the last remaining landscapes like this in the valley. Today, our valley only has 1% as a traditional landscape at all. Much of it has been turned into cropland. Even here, just outside of this traditional landscape, you see much cropland growing up around it. It's started to intrude or has been intruding for years upon this native landscape. The spreading oaks are probably some of the most important in our area. They are called mother oaks by us. They are the ones that all these trees around there are probably their children. They are hundreds of years old, and we need to preserve those as best we can because they're the ones that have the genealogy to survive. These are oak woodlands, another type of oak environment where oaks grow close together. Some of these oaks are still about as old as the mother oak would be. They just grow a little slower because they have more competition in their areas. So the trunks may be smaller, but they're about the same age. The rings on their trees are going to be much tighter together. There's a couple other pictures of this. There's another picture by Mount Pisgah down by Eugene. of a similar oak woodland where everything's tightly packed together, but it's in this sort of traditional pattern. What's not traditional, though, is all this vegetation that should be burnt down every year to maintain a healthy environment. And so we are working on plans for burning areas, seeing what happens, really as kind of a test, not just for us, but really to prove to the surrounding communities that are non-native that we can actually do safe fire projects in their area without burning down the valley. So that is an ongoing educational moment. So here we are setting fire, and we're actually getting children involved, tribal children involved from an early age, so they get used to it as a tool, as a helper to their environment, and not see it and fear it. Here we are again, watching the fires, maintaining them, and then trying to figure out how many in what happens in 1, in 2, and 3 years. Does the acorn production here increase? We think that from other studies in California that the white oaks are going to respond similarly to not just the fire, but really the smoke itself will cause the trees to react and produce a lot of acorns, perhaps this year, because this is the year we're going to look for a lot of acorn growth in the area. It's been 2 years now since then. So here we go into the picture. A few weeks later after that, we went back and visited again, and fire didn't destroy. It actually is being regrown pretty well. The environment's fine. Nothing is really destroyed, but a few grasses, and that's it. So we need to get away from these notions that fire is only a destroyer. It's not. It's a rejuvenator, a renewer, like in our tribal stories have said. Here's your white oak acorns. So let's go into other stuff. Kalapuyans, again, lived throughout the valley for perhaps 10,000, 20,000 years or more. There were a good number of tribes at the time of settlement. This is as a reminder. I am technically in Salem today, so that's Chemeketa in this area right here of the map, kind of in the center of the map, really, where there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tribes just on the edge of that center. We have a very long history from, going back to oral histories. We see that people were running up to big mountains and peaks to escape flooding. I think that flooding was Missoula floods. And I know that Western Washington has similar stories of people going to the top of Takelma, Mount Takelma, and to escape waters there too. So we have these stories in the area that are pretty significant to us, suggesting that we have been here much longer than the 16 to 11,000 year Missoula floods. Since that time, the tribes like Kalapuyans were figured out like how their season reacts. They developed their own sort of planning, their calendar of when they did things, and were able to tell this to anthropologists back in the late 19th century. And we see that the Kalapuyans spent about a third of the year on Wapato and another third of the year on Camas. And not much suggestion of fishing here, only one suggestion of hunting, suggesting that, plants were the major part of their annual seasonal movements. Because hunting could always be had, and then fishing was actually pretty easy to do. And if you needed a salmon, you could always go trade with other peoples to the north, like the Chinook people, for salmon. And so their seasonal round looks something like this. Winter village in the top, and then they would have hunting camps about this time of the year, getting ready for spring salmon, spring Chinook. Camas root camp maybe at this time too. Weaving materials, huckleberry camp, trade camp. They may go trading with the excess materials they get from Camas. In midsummer, they may be going up to the mountains to collect berries and weaving materials, and then fall salmon or steelhead comes into the valley, and they are able to fish for those. Fall prairie fire, hazelnut camps, and then more hunting camps in the wintertime, and then more trade gatherings they would go to for negotiating for wives, negotiating relationships with the tribes, getting more wealth items, and trading for foodstuffs. So this is kind of what their seasonal land looks like, and they're going to be the Kalapuyans are going to be really highly plant-based economy because they had a ton of roots growing in this valley, like I've heard for Western Washington too. So these are some of those plants. If you don't know what those things are, this is camas. It's a purple plant, purplish to blue flowering plant, and these are the bulbs on the side over here. And then on the right side and the left side, we see wapato, another pretty major food from the early winter, late winter, sometimes late winter harvesting. Um, so those are pretty significant staples for the Kalapuyans and other tribes like the Chinookans in the area. And so what we're figuring out is that the pattern is that they will burn fields, they will harvest and burn fields, and then they'll rotate crops. So they don't go back to the same fields every year. They'll rotate different fields that are also plentiful, and then maybe a 3 to 5 year rotation go back to the original fields again. So they allow the crops to sort of like revive, rejuvenate, get bigger again, and then go back to those fields again. In the meantime, they're setting fires and burning and helping the nutrients in the plants grow bigger every year. And so that's kind of what they're doing. And then while they're at the camps, they're cooking the food up, preserving it, and they'll take it to their winter village and they'll preserve it in cool underground pits for winter use, like winter foods, or for trade items. So going back into environment and things that have happened to our environment, this is what the Willamette Valley kind of looks like today. If you drive through the valley, it's pretty much farm fields. Again, about 1% of the whole valley is actually traditional landscape anymore. Much of that is probably at the tops of these buttes that have not been developed so much. But it's really just dry, arid farmland. And I wonder, when I grew up here, I didn't really wonder why there was just dry, arid farmland all around us when it's constantly raining all the time in Oregon, as you probably suspect. And here I am on the top of Peterson Butte, which is in the Santiam territory. So back in the 1930s, this is what our environment would do about this time of year. It'd be a lot of rain, and then all of a sudden, these rivers would come down, and there'd be all these swailing, ponding flood areas that developed alongside rivers and creeks and streams. And so this was controlled by a project called the Willamette Valley Project that put in a series of 13 dams all around the periphery of the valley, and then began these sort of ditching and dredging and draining activities in the center with farmers. So that has been going on for now more than 100 years. I really got into this with my research on Lake Labiche some years ago. It's actually an essay on my blog site. It's called Draining Lake Labiche. If you want to look at it. That's my initial research. But since then, I've actually expanded that a little bit. But I'll just tell you the basics here. So Lake Labiche was this big, sort of long lake structure above Salem, above Chemeketa. Tribes on either side of it, the Chemeketans, the Chemawans, and the Molalla people, also in the valley, would come to Lake Labiche and harvest things like wapato, like they would do hunting, they would do fishing, and harvest other things. So they would come there as kind of a major sort of food area all the time. And so I suspected this years ago, and I grew up in Salem, so I was wondering what it was like. Why is today the whole lake drained and gone? So I figured out that through doing research in the newspapers that these farmers that initially, and you see these farmer plots and these fields all around the lake, they couldn't do much with the water. They didn't know how to sort of manage it because they wanted to use all of their land for farms. And every time they put their fields inside of these yellow swaley areas that would happen seasonally when there was a lot of rainfall, a lot of moisture, they would flood out. So they're not very happy about that. So they attracted settlers to come to these rich settlers to come to the area called the Hayes brothers from California. They bought 1,000 acres of land in Lake Labiche at $1 an acre because this land was all considered what was called worthless land. And so you can get it for $1 an acre. They spent then $150,000 of their own money to dig a trench, a ditch all the way to the Willamette River. That was a 6 mile long trench that took a couple of years to build. And then at the end of that, 1918, they were able to fully drain off Lake Labiche to the point where it was drier than before. Since that time, they put more effort into a dam and some, other kind of pumping activity. But it's really by 1918, it was pretty much ready to go, and all that land was then being sold and claimed by settlers coming in and turning it into basically onion fields. Because ball onions require like a really nice soil. The soil is first rate now. It's black, loamy peat soil, the best soil you could imagine for growing anything. There were reportedly hundreds of thousands of different animals and plants that lived here initially, but they destroyed all of that and turned that into a dry lake bed. And then that was all helped by various technological developments like drain tiling, where they put a set of tiles some 18 inches underground, uh, very close together, and that the water is constantly then 24/7 being drained out to local ditches and then leaving the land faster than ever before, because otherwise we just have too much rainfall for growing crops on a continual basis in Oregon. So this has been an ongoing project, still being taught in schools and still being practiced by many farms. Are still putting in drain tiling to expand their crop areas all over the place. And this is now a worldwide phenomenon, but I believe much of it was built around Oregon, the actions in Oregon and Oregon State University Agricultural Experimental Division, and their work trying to perfect things like ditching and drain tiling. So this is the land today. Much of it is onion fields. Some has been now turned into hazelnuts and blueberries, but it's a very black, loamy soil. It actually never really depletes in nutrients because there's constant farming here every year, and there's never an area that goes fallow. And there is at least some 15 feet of peat soil underneath the top layers. We've done some drilling, and found at least 15 feet, if not more, of the soil. So this is a very old lake bed. We believe it existed before the Missoula floods. It survived through the floods and exists today. And so there is perhaps a lot of information contained in these lake soils that we want to sort of extract. So this is an area that about 70 acres owned by a farmer who was an onion farmer, and he gave up some 20 years ago doing onion farming. He wasn't paying enough for him, so he got into Ducks Unlimited and other projects to give him some money to turn this into an ecological reserve. And this is what's happening. This last winter, he allowed this water to return because he was destroying the drain tiling. And we see ducks returning to this sort of beginning lake structure here. The lake only lasts a few weeks because there's still quite a bit of draining, but we're seeing the beginnings of a restoration project. He also called me some years ago after I did my research on this, and he told me that, well, he's got this wapato growing back on the property in 4 large plots, and he never planted it. So that is pretty significant. We think that there's probably some sort of a seed bank in the soil that, all this onion farming hasn't destroyed everything. And that if you let the land go back to its original state, many of the native plants will return. So this wapato is now growing back. It's not the ideal climate or environment. There's not enough moisture still, but it is growing back. And the moisture is only about a few inches down below the topsoil. And we are now seeing the regrowth of wapato. These are very early stage. Some of these plants are only a couple of years old. I figure we need at least 5 to 10-year-old plants to really produce large wapatos, but you can see we're going back every year now, watching the progress, helping the farmers best we can. I've brought camas seed there so we can replant a camas on the property, things like that. And so we are very heartened that we can do much more with restoration projects if in the right environment. Following along with the previous history, so these farmers at Lake Labiche, they sold off much of their land after that became first-rate growing land. Probably made a bunch of money on that because it was worth way more than $1 an acre. Then they reinvested in this area around Wapto Lake outside of Gaston and Hillsboro, Oregon. This was actually a very large Wapto area that was pretty well known. The Tualatin tribes in at Wapto Lake lived kind of on the southeast side of the lake, and they wanted the lake as part of their reservation from 1851 treaties that were never ratified. That never happened because the treaty was not ratified, but and eventually they were moved to Grand Ronde, but that's what they wanted. So it's a very significant place. We have a lot of research around that. In my research online, I also found that Wapto Lake had large flocks of tens of thousands of canvasback ducks, geese, things like that in the lake, and that it attracted sportsmen from Portland to come down there, set up duck blinds, and shooting ducks in the lake every year in the midst of it being drained. And so by 1935, the lake was also drained. Since that time, in 1970s or 80s, farmers began giving up because it was very expensive to sort of maintain the drainage mechanisms in the valley. There's a lot of water coming down through that valley all the time, and so that's very expensive to maintain. So they began selling the land back to the federal government to recreate a national wildlife preserve, and now the Wapto Lake National Wildlife Preserve has been recreated. We still have some years to see the lake return, Wapto return, but we're hoping that to see that happen within 5-10 years from now. So in my own work, I've been looking at, what is the incidence of wetlands and how did that maybe affect the culture and of the tribes and the plants and animals of the valley. And so, because, kind of spurred by those other research on these giant lake structures that were being drained and the problem of having too much water in the valley, whereas everything else was ideal, pretty good sunlight, really good soils, but there's way too much water for the farmers. So what has happened in the last 180 years that they have been draining and destroying water systems to the point where we have an arid landscape. Going back to the 1850 GLO maps, General Land Office maps, I'm finding that there's quite a few large wetlands there was in the valley. This is the wet canvas prairie out. Essentially, in that area, we saw the oak savanna by Basket Slough, by Rickyall, and then we have in the Central Valley on the left side, sorry, is Lake Labiche here. You see on the bottom, and then we see I wrote Poison. It's actually Poisson Lake here, or Fish Lake out by Mount Angel, and then a miry swamper slough up by between Woodburn and St. Paul. So that's area in the middle. That's suggesting there's quite a bit of wetland in the middle of the valley. Out in the Tualatin Valley, there were lots of swamps coming out of the Coast Range. One of them is still there, the Killen Wetlands Nature Park. And then down by this whole area called Kansas City, there giant swamp there too. And then south of, it shows here in the map, Marysville, but that's actually today Corvallis, Oregon. This whole south map, almost the whole GLO map, this blue area, which I've sort of banded for you here, is all wet prairie, and I suspect that also meant wet camas prairie. Quite a bit of camas in the area, because we actually have a lot of camas growing there right now. So that's a large map. And then, if you go south of Eugene, there is this area called Camas Swale in the area of Queswell, and we actually have ethnography from settlers saying, yeah, there was a camas whale there, and the native people were gathering camas in that spot all the time. So so this is becoming a trend. I think at least the valley was a seasonal wetland much of the year, and that it may have been a natural and native part of the environment that the tribes had to adjust to in their culture and their lifestyle. And I don't know exactly yet all of the different ways that influence the tribes, but I would bet that things like roads would have to be put up on higher areas so they wouldn't walk through water, which is why places like the territorial highways were up on sort of like hilly areas on the side of the valley, not through the center. And things like mounds in the valley, which we know the tribes built, may have been built there because they wanted to basically be sleeping above a seasonal flooding, not inside the flood itself. So that's a possibility of why there are so many Kalapuya mounds in the valley. Again, back to 1841, Henry Eld and George Emmons from the Wilkes expedition, they recorded these large wetland areas all throughout the valley, one of which they call Lake La Malie, 80 feet in width and 3/4 mile in length and about a foot deep in both these accounts from the same day. So this may have been something or even more prominent than what we see in the picture here. My own research into an area called Minto Brown Park outside of Salem. John Minto was a early settler of Oregon. He brought things like sheep and orchards to Oregon and was very dominant in the Salem area. Had a large farm on this technically called an island. And let's see, so this is an area that has all this juncus and camas growing in the farm field. In 2022, I noticed there was some rainfall in May and suddenly this appeared. And this is that swaling, that seasonal swaling that I was talking about. Also sometimes called ponding action. There was enough water here. There was fish in the water. So this only lasted a couple days because I went back to visit this pond and it was gone. The native plants came back no problem. They have no problem with partial wetland environment, whereas non-native plants, would not do as well. Farmers would be very upset about that probably. So I guess my thesis has been for a while, for some couple of years now. Yeah, okay, so fire is something that we need to bring back, something absolutely we need to be doing to help restore our environments. But in our area, water was very dominant too, and that also has been excised from our environment. So if we're going to really do restoration work and bring back a traditional landscape, and then so that we can learn from it as part of our culture, then we need to also bring back water. Water has to be something that we allow to return. Is not we don't problematize or make enemies of the area. Allow ditching and draining to be destroyed, and then water return and become part of the ground soils around us. No long some areas could be easily returned from an air environment from the air environment they are today. I'm thinking areas like the Lucky Mute could be done that way, or the Pudding River, or certain areas of the valley, because there's been reports from federal and United Nations agencies that suggest that we're losing wetlands faster than ever before, and if we don't preserve 1/3 of our land for animals and plants, native animals and plants, we're no longer going to have native animals and plants any longer. So our valley today is 1% native landscape. We need to get at least 32 or 32% back in some manner to bring back native animals and plants, or they may disappear forever. It'd be really hard to restore them. So, not to mention the fact that we need that as tribal people for our culture, because our culture didn't really come from nothing. They came from our environment, things around us that made us who we are, the foods, the animals, the plants, and our relationship with them, which is very important to us. And that also needs to return if we're going to return the tribes back to their cultural health. So that's pretty much it. As you can see, I've redrawn Kalapuya man with a little bit of water on the landscape here, because a lot of our descriptions suggest that he lived on the prairie, and he and his wife or wives would dig camas all the time. But that prairie was not a dry prairie; it was a wet seasonal prairie, and so we need to think about that when we think about the tribes. Just a little call out for my book again. Those that have it, thank you. Hope you're having fun reading it. Those that don't, maybe time to pick it up. It's not too expensive, about $24.95 in most bookstores, or less if you get it on as an ebook. So it's not too long, easy to read, and has a lot of detail in it. So I hope you will pick it up and enjoy it. I want to say kapai. That's the Kalapuya word for hello and goodbye. And I have to leave you with a sunset here because apparently in all anthropological presentations you have to have a sunset. So here we go. I've done my thing.
Wow. Well, let's have a virtual round of applause for Professor Lewis, just from the chat and messages that was mesmerizing. Thank you. And particularly interesting. I mean, there's a number of things. Yeah, round of applause, which you'll see, and especially if you go to the bottom of the chat, you'll see all sorts of praise. I've got a list of questions. Thank you for talking. There's a heart. Thank you for talking about the prairies and fires, because we understand from the Nisqually tribe and others that where Fort Steilacoom is located, where the Hudson's Bay Company attempted farming, before that was a place with fires, and a lot of us have had trouble visualizing what that looks like. And you've just allowed us to see what that looks like and what the cycle was. That's actually really valuable for our interpretive program, for whatever that's worth. So that was really interesting. One question that someone had, the first question was, how do you control the fire? How do you put it out? Obviously you do, but how is that done? Because we're all used to media pictures of, Hollywood celebrities fleeing flames. How is it controlled?
Well, I believe in the past they would wait until there was a little bit of a moisture climate before they would set them. But the thing is that in the prairies at least, that if you're setting fire every year, there's not a lot of built-up of fuel. So setting the fires then every year on the same prairie would be what they call a cool burn, which would move through the prairie fast, and that would not stick around and destroy everything. So if there's nothing to easily burn, then it doesn't stick around and destroy everything. So that's a thing. And so we haven't yet prepped our land for that, and we need to do something about that because we are living. Like I say to a lot of my students, we're living in ovens if we don't. So.
Yeah, thank you. The other thing, before I ask a couple of questions that were asked, I just want to briefly ask you about John Flett, since the museum is located in Lakewood. Thank you for filling in a gap, because and this is why there's this weird dichotomy between Washington and Oregon. If you read the Lakewood biography of John Flett, he attempts to farm on the site of Fort Steilacoom, the Hudson's Bay farm. He goes to the Willamette Valley. He's in, quote, your world, unquote. And then he comes back in, I think, 1859, and he teaches on the Puyallup Reservation. And that was just, we've always kind of wondered do you have any idea what that sequence was, why he would have gone to teach at a reservation?
Well, I mean, I believe on balance that Bill Palmer did a pretty good job in terms of preserving the tribes. He kind of was a very moral individual. And so he then worked with people that were similar to him, that were very sort of moral individuals, ethical, and want to do the best thing for the tribes. I don't see anything negative from Flett. I mean, I think technically the whole removal project is a negative thing, but in terms of preserving tribes and treating them with respect, and maybe I don't see anything negative about Flett here. I haven't done maybe an in-depth look at Flett. We do have quite a bit of information about him through Palmer's records. He was again involved in the administration of tribes. He went throughout the valley. He worked with various folks. He was very poor at handwriting, as you probably suspect. His handwriting was very, very bad. So you can always know when he would make the note as opposed to he would dictate it to somebody else. But he was a dependable worker for Palmer, and it didn't seem to be anything negative that came out about him. He lived right at on the west side of Wapta Lake. So we do have in the GLO maps for Oregon, if you want to look at them yourself, just zoom in right on that area by Gaston, and you'll see in one of the maps Flett mentioned and he had a little uh, homestead right there.
And folks in Lakewood or in the area would know there's a flat wetland preserved across the street from Clover Park Technical College. So and there was for many years, there was a Flet dairy that was started by his daughter. And so that's how he's known in our area. Anyway, I don't mean to monopolize this for Lakewood. There were some other questions.
Sure.
What do you think the population of the valley was prior to initial European entry, before the diseases were introduced? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, most estimates are around 16,000 for Kalapuyans. I think you could probably add another thousand, thousand and a half for Molalla people. So somewhere in the range of 18,000 maybe.
Okay. What were the Indian schools like in Northwest Oregon, specifically Forest Grove? Like is probably a big phrase. How would you characterize, what they?
Yeah, I mean it was the first off-reservation boarding school for us. Didn't last very long, and actually there was actually the first couple classes were mainly Washington territorial students. So they were not Oregon students, Oregon tribal students. So that's something. So that's probably very significant to you people up there. And then there was a fire, and then they decided to move to I believe it was a cheaper location at uh, what's called Chemawa. Moved the whole school to Chemawa. That location is right exactly within the footprint of Lake Labiche area, and I believe they bought it. They bought the land at like the $1 an acre, and then they put the school there really for a really cheap price. So they stuck the school literally inside a swamp, and then later on they used some of the money from the students working in the fields around there to buy more land. So they actually took the money from the students to do that. So, uh, yeah. So what it was like, there are dissertations on this stuff, but in the initial, like you probably heard, initial days, it was just like any other school where they were teaching them to be essentially Americans. Couldn't speak the native language, they couldn't dress their native dress, they had to cut their hair and sometimes take American sounding names. The same story you've heard before, yeah.
Yeah. The parallels between Washington, we think of them, especially when I look at the history books, I read the different places, but there was really a blending, and it's fascinating to hear you say there were Washington students in that school. How did what we call the Puget Sound Treaty Wars ripple to Oregon? Did they have any effect?
We don't hear much about them here. I think there was a kind of a barrier at the Columbia because what happened is the federal government set up these different superintendencies called Indian superintendencies, and what they did is they eventually, when Washington Territory became a big deal, they assigned the territorial administration of Native peoples above the Columbia to another person, and initially that was Isaac Stevens, as you know, and then later on it became other people, but really, so the events in the North were kept separate from the events in Oregon.
Do you know who might be researching the historical extent of tribal burning in forest environments? That may be you, but the historical extent of the locations.
Yeah, are you talking historical in the anthropological way, like in the recorded time period since settlers came here, or are you talking about historical, like prehistoric time period?
That's a good question. How about we be greedy and ask about both?
Well, I think there probably may be some studies of that. I mean, I'm involved in studies up in the Cascades. So that's a piecemeal kind of effort. Nobody's really done a comprehensive survey. That's going to take generations to do, probably, with even new technologies out there to do that. So it's really hard to sort of find evidence of burning. Some of it is being done by coring in lake beds and pond beds and stuff like that, because sometimes those lake beds preserve a layer of soot or ash that you can actually record, and so that's a good place to go. Otherwise, since many of the forests have been knocked down and we're in this third and fourth growth of timber now, the record of the fires that some of the old growth would have is pretty much gone. So we're getting lucky in the Cascades because we're finding that the old ponderosas and even sort of cut down, stumps of oak trees and stuff like that sometimes have in the rings themselves, there are marks that there's information that there was actually burning happening at various years. And so we're doing like dendrochronological work and stuff like that to figure out how often that burning happened. And so the repetitiveness of the burning suggests that it was human caused. We're finding that cycle to be 3 to 5 to even 7 years as a human cycle, what they call a cultural cycle, and then as opposed to a natural cycle, which is like 10 to 20 years, usually around 15, 16 years. So is the recurrence of natural fires. So, but that's in just one area. So there hasn't yet been anywhere a comprehensive analysis that's going to take millions of dollars and a lot more people than we have working on it today.
And then for people who have read your book, where do you go next? I don't get the sense that there are a lot of books on this subject, or
mine's kind of a
there's your
unicorn.
blog.
Yeah, I think mine's kind of a unicorn book out there. Not much like it in this area. I guess the closest you'd find is George Aguilar's when the river ran fast or something like that. So Aguilar has a pretty good book on that, and then Patricia Warath Phillips from the Coos tribe has a book called Ethnobotany of the Coos, Lorengpas la Isla. So that'd be another good one to go to for Oregon, at least. I don't know all the books for Washington State. Yeah, so where do I go? I think I'm working on other projects in the South Valley. If you read through the book, I don't have a ton about the South Valley, and I'm going increasingly environmental and looking at water resources and stuff. And so I think I'm going to go towards the South Valley, where we have a lot more evidence of huge wetland areas and water resources being significant. And then I didn't have a lot of evidence about the Kalapuyans in that area, so I want to bring that in as I'm finding it. So yeah, I'm just going to expand on what I've already done to do more about in the South Valley, I think.
Are there language resources available for the Kalapuya language or languages?
Yeah, absolutely. There are these things. We do have a dictionary out that we've sent around to various libraries and universities. And then there is the Kalapuya text, which is the main oral history book we use, which is up at initially it was published through UW Press. And if you go on to the UW Library digital website, look up Kalapuya text, you'll find that they have it online, and you can read the stories there if you want. If you happen to be able to read Kalapuyan, go ahead, go for it. But there is also English in there too. And so that's the main text right there. I sent a copy of the Kalapuya dictionary to UW Library, so they have one there too. I don't know. I haven't done that same. I probably should do the same thing with Washington State. I haven't done that yet, but I know they have at least 1 or 2 copies at in Portland at OHS, and then at PSU. So we've hit most of the libraries in Oregon, and I have my own personal copy as well. So.
Okay, thank you. And in this question, we're getting a little flurry of questions here, so thanks for your patience. This question came in just as you were answering. Are the language systems similar? How was communication amongst natives when first moved to the Grand Ronde Reservation?
It must have been difficult. We had 8 or 9 different languages at the reservation, and I think that's kind of the story behind why Chinook became the main tribal language, because it was a common language spoken between all the tribes, at least in part, and then later people learn it, and so it became this sort of common native language at the reservation that people spoke in the home, while when they left the home and went into sort of essentially white spaces, they would speak English. So yeah, that's why Chinook today is the only language that Grand Ronde tribe is actually working on to teach the next generation how to speak it.
Okay. One comment, super interesting, telling some great historically silenced histories. Thanks for your powerful, important work, which other folks have said as well. The unratified treaties are an interesting part of the story, as well as the various lakes and their stories and reclaiming them. I'm curious about the intersection of hot springs in these stories. I'm curious if there has been work in Oregon to create curriculum around the native plants and their teachings that you highlight, or native ed curriculum at pre-kindergarten to 12th level generally. So I guess a question about what are we teaching the young people these days?
Oregon had a big curriculum project, data curriculum project, some years ago. It's been available for 5, 6 years now. It's on the Oregon Education website. Look up Oregon Indian Education on the website, and there are all these modules you can download for various grades. And so I haven't done a survey of that to see exactly how much they address the subjects just questioned. Although there are a number of modules created by tribes, so I would guess that there probably are things in there that are ethnobotanical or environmental or something about the tribes. Yeah.
Can you say more about how groups physically moved between the different camps throughout the year? What was the process of movement?
Well, they either walked or they got in their canoe and rowed, paddled, or when horses came along, they used horses. So that's the way they did it.
Okay.
So generally, they would go to areas that they already knew there were resources. We have some, like in the Kalapuya stories and other places, that they talk about how they would go into the mountains and take the whole family with them, and they would go set up a camp. And the men would take off hunting, and the women would be collecting berries and then processing foods and stuff back in the main camp. And while the men are out hunting, they'll notice that there's like large berry fields that they could access, and would notify the women where they are, and they would go there. Women would like deviate there to the berry fields to pick berries. And so there was this process of doing that in that story, and that story happened in the Coast Range. And so I'm assuming that's probably the process that people followed. It was everybody was doing, grandparents, kids, everybody was there. And you'd find groups of, maybe between, 6 and 25 people out in one place, doing these kind of activities all throughout the year. And they knew exactly when certain plants are going to be ripe, ready to go, and they could read the landscape, the TEK, about like when this is ready, then this is going to be ready. That whole thing. So they knew exactly what to do. That's why they developed this, or they wrote down they told the Kalapuya calendar. Various tribes have these sort of yearly calendars that they knew about, and they would be directed by elders in the community about what to do, how to do it, when to start the fires, things like that. So.
The next question came in. The Fort Steilacoom buildings were supervised by a guy named Lieutenant August Couts, who has 50 descendants in the Nisqually tribe, but also was wounded in the Rogue River War. Where did that fit into the resettlement, or what would you say about the Rogue River War for people unfamiliar with that?
The Rogue River War actually caused Indian agents to basically move faster to place the tribes on reservations, because there was all these kind of associated threats from the periphery of the war, all throughout Oregon, really, to go for the ultimate destruction or extermination of all tribal people. And much of that language was very much like you hear about people talk about exterminating wolves and anything else like that, any other kind of pest. And so people were literally suggesting in newspapers that we destroy or commit genocide on all Native people everywhere. And so we started to see, again, outside of the war area, down in Southern Oregon, in the Umpqua area, in the Willamette Valley, and on the Columbia, with all these people committing acts of violence and aggression and murders against Native people that were completely living peacefully and not at war with anybody. So the 18 agents decided to move people onto reservations, and at Grand Ronde, they even created a thing called the Grand Ronde Guard, which was a force of 60 men to guard the reservation from anybody coming on and committing acts of violence. And they built a fence and everything else. So eventually the military took over and they put a military guardhouse on the road called Fort Yamhill. But yeah, so that was a very serious threat, and so people were they had to do whatever to save the tribes from further extermination.
Before colonization, did the Kalapuya have horses and dogs?
Yeah, absolutely. We have stories of them using dogs for hunting mainly. There's a pretty funny story of them. I think it was the Lucky people having dogs, and then near a farmer's land, and the farmer sent a letter of complaint to Joel Palmer saying, "Hey, these Indians here near here have these dogs, and they keep on chasing my hogs around." And I thought it was a kind of a funny story, but I actually wrote an essay about that on my blog. So if you want to read that, have fun.
All right. Well, we have to go to the blog now because we're gonna Professor Lewis go in just a minute here. Have any graduate students proposed to use paleontology to complete, I may be mispronouncing that, to complete environmental reconstruction in the old lake sediments in the valley? Maybe the question is also, how active are graduate students in this? I know you're a professor, but you also rely on students to carry some of the work. Is there much going on with graduate students, or little or a lot, or what's going on?
Yeah, I think a lot of the grad students are really pushed by what's in the media. So since the Klamath River is in the media right now, there a lot of them are working on Klamath River issues because there's going to be lots of studies that happen as the river changes back to its natural way and the fish return. And so we start to see a lot of that happening. And so that's a great lesson for what could be happening on the Columbia in a few years from now. So, right. So, but I do have students working on water issues. Recently, I had a student ask me for advice from Washington State about water issues, water studies in Washington State. So I think a lot of folks are working from different angles on this, and I'm pretty early career, so I think I'm going to get more people working with me on things in the future. So I don't have much of my work is actually done by myself alone, and so I only have maybe one person or two people a year working with me. So it's not like all my work is done by other people. I do actually more of my work on my own than anything else. So,
final question: what are the two things that most surprise your students in your college classes? What do you tell them where their eyes go open and like, really?
well, I mean, all this history that I just told you is more than they normally get in school. So they are always surprised to hear this history. Literally after the first week or so of class, they will tell me that they've had more Native history than all the rest of their life combined. And this is really an indictment on our education system and the fact that we're not teaching about Native history, Native culture in our public schools, in high school, in grade school, in middle school. And that is a shame because we are the first people of this land. We were here and have been here all along, and so for the education system to basically not be teaching our histories appropriately is very wrong. And so your children or perhaps grandchildren are quite upset when they get to college and they realize they have to relearn everything they learned in high school.
Wow, that's a
So
great
you could
statement to
do a
close
lot.
on.
I mean, a lot of questions I get is what we do now is like, well, you could do a lot by going to your local school boards and say, hey, I want my kids, I want my grandkids, and anybody in my community to be learning about Native American history. If you ask them if they are teaching it, ask to look at what they are teaching, because a lot of times it's some generalized nothing. And so, but really hold them to the fire on that and say, if you're not doing it in an appropriate way, you're not working with the tribes, you're not doing it appropriately, you're not offering relevant information about our area rather than more of a nationalistic area, then we need you to do the right thing. So the only way you're going to change that in most school districts is if you go to the school board and say, hey, do better.
That was actually one of the questions about how do you work with your school. And I noticed a couple people had responded with resource, and I think you just answered them as well, because that was
Yeah.
one of the questions. Would you
And
have any
that's a
advice?
big problem. It's a huge problem.
Yeah.
In Oregon, I don't know about Washington, but in Oregon, the school boards are a little more autonomous than we would think. The state can't order everybody to do everything. So we have now state developed curriculum, but the majority of school boards in Oregon do not offer that curriculum at all in any school in their district. So
Wow.
that's a huge problem.
Okay. Well, um, thank you. Again,
Thank you.
everyone in chat has been peppering this with thank yous. And I hate to close this because this is just absolutely fascinating, but we should give you your life back. Thank you for your good patience. Thank you for bringing a lot of knowledge to us. Another round of virtual applause, and we'll let everybody go. But again, thank you. Thank you for your time and for putting this together and answering all these questions.
Thanks, Walter. It's been fun. See you guys.
All right. Everyone take care. Thank you for this time in your day.